They accidentally saw me unclothed, yet the alien sisters didn't turn away. The alarm was already going off when I knocked the altar over. I want to be very clear about one thing before I tell you what happened next. I am not a brave man. I am not a decorated soldier or a celebrated scientist, or someone who has ever, in any classroom, any office, or any gathering of people, been the most impressive person in the room. My name is Marcus Hale. I am 29 years old. I grew up in a small town in the Midlands, went to a university that people outside my home county have never heard of, and spent 6 years of my academic life studying languages that most of the world had forgotten existed. The single greatest achievement of my professional career, up until 6 months ago, was correctly identifying the grammatical voice system of a language spoken by fewer than 400 people in a mountain region of Central Asia. I published a paper about it. 11 people read it. 3 of them were my former professors, and I suspect at least one of those read only the abstract. That paper got me flagged by a government screening program. I did not know the program existed. I did not know that anyone in any government office was watching academic linguistic publications for patterns they considered useful. I did not know that the particular combination of abilities I had, language pattern recognition, genuine comfort with total cultural immersion, and what one evaluator later described in his notes as an unusual and possibly structural tolerance for sustained confusion, was exactly what a very specific and very new kind of international initiative needed. I found out about all of this when 2 people in suits that cost more than my monthly rent appeared at my office door and told me they needed to speak with me. The conversation took 3 days. Then there were tests. Psychological evaluations that felt like someone was trying to determine exactly how much discomfort I could absorb before I stopped functioning. A medical examination. 4 separate interviews with individuals who identified themselves only by first names and always sat with their backs to the window, as if the light behind them was a tool they had decided to use. At the end of all of it, they told me I had been selected to be the first human being ever embedded aboard a Sarvathi diplomatic vessel as a cultural liaison specialist. I should have asked far more questions than I did before signing anything. I signed the forms and went home and sat at my kitchen table for an hour thinking about the 11 people who had read my paper, and then I thought about a species I had been studying in classified briefings for 4 months, and how nothing in those briefings had fully prepared me for the reality of it, and then I started packing. The Sarvathi are not what you imagine when you imagine what an alien species might look like. They are not small and gray with oversized eyes. They are not threatening in the obvious physical sense. They are tall, some of them close to 2.5 meters, with 6 limbs arranged in 2 distinct sets, the lower 4 used for movement, and the upper 2 used the way humans use arms, for reaching and carrying, and the 100 small physical expressions of communication that living things perform, without consciously deciding to perform them. Their bodies are covered in a hard exterior shell that changes color at different angles of light, shifting through silver and cobalt, and something between deep green and warm gold, that I spent my first full week aboard the ship trying to name accurately, and eventually gave up on, settling for iridescent in my field notes, and knowing it was insufficient. They have compound eyes that receive light from a much wider angle than human eyes are capable of, which means they are always registering more of their immediate environment than we are. They are rarely surprised by anything that happens in front of them, or to either side, or partially behind them, and they have a crest of long, rigid feathers extending from the crown of the head down to the middle of the back. Those feathers are never still. They move constantly in small increments that are, once you understand the system, a complete language in themselves. In the 4 months I spent studying the Sarvathi before I boarded the ship, I memorized what I could of the crest position system. By the time I actually arrived on the vessel, I could recognize roughly 30 of the most common positions with reasonable accuracy, the total documented positions numbered in the hundreds. There was a great deal of learning still ahead of me. The ship was called the Vale Karen. It translated approximately as vessel of carried memory, though the ship's lore keeper told me later, with patient and specific precision, that this translation lost most of the actual meaning, the way that a pressed flower loses most of what made it a living flower. The ship was enormous and very quiet, and it smelled like warm stone, and something I was never able to identify, something that kept me in a state of mild alertness from the moment I boarded, as if the air itself was paying close attention to everything that happened inside it. My quarters were small, but thoughtfully adapted for a human occupant. The Sorvathi assigned to my comfort had done their research. A bed, instead of the suspension cradle used by the crew. A food preparation area stocked with human-compatible supplies. A sealed water chamber that had been converted from one of the ship's purification ritual rooms, fitted with a basic flow system so that I could bathe using water rather than the chemical cleansing methods native to the Sorvathi, which were highly effective on exoskeleton and would have removed the surface layer of human skin in approximately 11 seconds. The captain was Vailmora, the eldest of 3 sisters who served aboard the vessel, and she was exactly the kind of person who you understood immediately was in precisely the right role. She ran the Vale Karen with a precision that I found admirable and only slightly intimidating, and she had formally acknowledged my presence on the first day with a crest movement that the translation program in my left earpiece described as cautious welcome. Since then, she had communicated with me exclusively through a junior officer, never directly, which my briefing materials had informed me was not a slight, but simply protocol. I was new. I had not yet earned the standing that direct address required. I was operating on borrowed permission, and everyone on the ship knew it, and so did I. Her sisters were, in the way that siblings always are, simultaneously familiar and entirely distinct from each other. Vale Sarah was the ship's first navigator, the second sister, and her defining quality was a precision different in kind from the captain's. The captain's precision was about maintaining order and control. Vale Sarah's precision was about truth. She was the kind of person, or being, whose mind simply operated on the most direct line available between question and accurate answer, and who had no use for the sideways motion and circling approach that human conversation often relied upon. She was not unfriendly. She was just genuinely uninterested in anything that was not the shortest path between one true thing and the next. I found her hard to talk to in my first weeks aboard, not because she was unkind, but because my social habits were built around indirection, and she had no corresponding habits at all. By the end of my time on the ship, I found her the easiest person I had ever had a real conversation with, because there was never any question about what she actually meant. Kale Lyra was the youngest sister and the ship's lore keeper, which meant she was responsible for the preservation and transmission of Sorvathi cultural knowledge, the history, the ceremonies, the language records, the accumulated documentation of every contact the collective had made with other species across generations of diplomatic service. She was quieter than her sister, in a completely different way. Vale Sarah's quiet was directed outward and focused. Kale Lyra's quiet was directed inward, as if she was perpetually cataloging everything she observed and filing it in an internal system that was very large, very organized, and running all the time beneath everything else she was doing. She had a habit of tilting her head at a specific angle whenever she was thinking hard about something. I noticed it in my first week. By my third week, I had realized that the angle varied slightly, depending on whether she was working through something genuinely unknown to her or approaching the solution to something she had nearly solved. I wrote it in my notes. I wrote almost everything in my notes. It was the one consistent, useful thing I did during that first month. What I failed to pay sufficient attention to, on the evening of my 34th day aboard the Vale Karen, was whether the water chamber at the end of the secondary corridor was occupied before I entered it. My excuse, and I want to be completely honest about how inadequate it is that the chamber had been empty at that hour for 34 consecutive days. I had built my routine carefully. I had studied the common schedule posted in the corridor outside the chamber every day. I had confirmed my reading of it with the translation program. I had verified my understanding of the Sorvathi time notation system against the actual clock 3 separate times in my first 2 weeks, because I did not trust myself not to misread it. For 34 days, the chamber had been available at the time I used it, and I had made the error of treating consistent data as permanent fact rather than as a pattern requiring continued verification. What the common schedule did not include, because it logged only communal and ceremonial uses of shared spaces, not private ones, was a twice-monthly resonance bonding ritual that Vale Sarah and Kale Lyra conducted together in that specific chamber at that specific hour. The ritual used the particular atmospheric conditions created by the chamber's warmth and humidity. It was, I learned much later, and with full understanding of why the learning came late, an intimate ceremony. Not intimate in the way that word sometimes carries complicated meaning between humans, but intimate in the way that some things belong only to specific people in specific moments. Private, not because they are wrong or shameful, but because they are deeply personal, a thing between the participants and no one else. The better word for it is sacred. It was a sacred ceremony, and I walked into it because the space I was entering had no door to knock on, only a pressure-sensitive entry panel, and I pressed it without hesitation, because 34 days had taught me nothing required hesitation at that hour, in that corridor. The panel opened. I stepped through. There was a single beat of complete and absolute silence, in which 3 living beings processed an enormous amount of entirely unexpected information all at once. Then I moved backward at a speed the human body reserves for genuine emergencies, hit my shoulder on the doorframe hard enough that I felt it in my back teeth, reached sideways with no plan whatsoever, and my hand closed around a ceremonial offering vessel made of carved dark stone, sitting on a low shelf beside the door. I pulled it toward me. I held it in front of me. I thought, with the desperate and baseless optimism of someone who has run out of better options in the space of about 2 seconds, that this was going to be fine. I had something to hold. Everything was going to be fine. The offering vessel was attached, by a thin dark chain I had not seen, and was not looking for, to a display rack of spirit crystals on the shelf directly behind it. There were 14 of them. Small, polished smooth, each one containing the name and the living memory of a Sarvathi ancestor, each one placed on that rack by a living family member at the time of that ancestor's passing, as an act of reverence that the Sarvathi tradition considered the most binding form of connection between the living and the dead. They had been arranged on that rack for approximately 60 years. When I pulled the vessel, the chain pulled the rack. When the rack tipped, all 14 crystals went with it. The sound they made when they struck the stone floor was high and brief and not loud, and somehow the smallness of the sound made every part of what had just happened worse. I left the room. I want to say that I walked. I did not walk. I moved at the kind of speed that the body accesses only in genuine emergency, and I made it back to my quarters with no memory at all of the corridor in between, as if the adrenaline had simply edited out the irrelevant footage and left me standing at my own bunk door without transition. I was sitting on the edge of my bunk with my face in both hands when the ship-wide klaxon activated. I had pressed the secondary alert trigger on the entry panel on my way out and had not noticed. The klaxon lasted 4 seconds before someone on the bridge shut it off. In those 4 seconds, every member of the crew of the Vale Karen, all 200 of them, became aware that something had happened somewhere on the ship. I sat in my quarters and thought, with complete clarity and total hopelessness, that my career as a cultural liaison specialist had lasted exactly 34 days, and that this was almost certainly my fault, in a way that was going to be very difficult to adequately explain. What I did not know, because I was sitting alone in my quarters constructing worst-case scenarios, was what was happening at the other end of the ship at that moment. Captain Vale Mora had reviewed the incident log from the chamber's atmospheric and sound sensors. She had sat in her command chair and listened to her bridge officers give their report, and asked one precise question, and then she had done something that none of them had anticipated. She had gone quiet for a long time. And then she had said, in the measured tone her officers recognized as indicating that she was thinking something significant, that she was not going to share entirely, that the human had entered the chamber without warning, which was a failure of knowledge rather than a failure of intent, that he had removed himself from the situation immediately after understanding what he had entered, which was a choice, that 34 days of careful and attentive behavior did not cease to be evidence, simply because of one incident whose full character was not yet understood. She said she would observe before she acted. She would hear from her sisters first. And then she said one additional thing, quietly, to the room rather than to any specific officer. She said that she had been observing the human since he boarded, and that she had noticed something she had not entered into any official log, because she did not yet have sufficient language for it. She said that he was soft in the way that soft things sometimes appeared to be weak until you looked more carefully, and that she was not yet ready to stop looking carefully. She ordered the incident classification closed and told her officers to return to their duties. In my quarters, I knew none of this had been said. My communication tablet chimed 40 minutes after I sat down on my bunk. It was a formal summons. Not from the captain's office. Not from the ship's diplomatic protocol officer. From Vale Sarah and Kale Lyra directly, as individuals, not in any official capacity. It requested my presence in the Hall of Translation at the beginning of the next activity period. I looked at that notification for a long time. Then I lay back on my bunk and spent the next several hours rehearsing apologies in every language I knew, including my 3 memorized Sorvathi phrases, none of which were adequate for what I had caused. The stars outside my small viewport moved past slowly as the ship held its heading through the dark. The station toward which we were traveling was still several days ahead, and the space around us was very large and very indifferent, and I felt, lying there in the quiet with the weight of the evening pressing down, like I had failed something that had not deserved to be failed. What I noticed, sometime in the middle of that long night, was that the sisters had summoned me toward them, not away from them, toward them, specifically. I did not understand what that meant yet, but I noticed it. Noticing things was still the only tool I had, and I was not going to stop using it, simply because I was frightened. The Hall of Translation carried a different smell at the early hour when I arrived for the summons. During the ship's working period, it held the warm and busy smell of electronics and concentrated effort. In the quiet of the period before the first full activity cycle, it smelled only of stone, a clean, listening kind of smell that I found easier to breathe than I had expected, given that I had not slept, and my nerves were in a state I would have described as precisely calibrated anxiety. I arrived 3 minutes before the designated time. I sat in the human-height chair that had been placed at one end of the long, low table, and I set my translation earpiece in with care, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I tried to determine what expression my face was currently presenting to the room. I concluded I could not successfully change it, and stopped trying. They came in together. Vale Sarah first, Kale Lyra a step behind, moving with the unhurried and particular fluid ease that I had spent weeks attempting to describe accurately in my field notes, and had never fully managed. I had written at one point that watching a Sorvathi cross a room was like watching water decide where it was going. Purposeful, but without visible effort, the destination already chosen before the movement began. I remained dissatisfied with that description, but had nothing better to replace it with. They sat across from me. Their crests were in a position I had not documented before, which gave me nothing useful to work with since my knowledge covered approximately a third of the full system. Neither of them spoke immediately. Sorvathi's silence, I had learned across 34 days, was not empty the way human silence sometimes was. It had texture and weight and purpose. This particular silence felt deliberate, as if they were holding space open in case I needed to fill it first. I did need to. I began talking. I told them I was sorry. I said it first in English and then attempted the Sorvathi phrase for regret that has caused harm to something that was sacred, which was a compounded word I had memorized with considerable effort over several weeks, and had never been entirely certain I was pronouncing with the correct register. When I said it, Kale Lyra's crest shifted very slightly in a direction I had observed once before, when a junior officer made an error in a ceremony, and the senior officers present chose to receive it as evidence of sincere effort rather than failure. That small movement gave me more steadiness than I had expected, and I continued. I explained everything. I explained that I had checked the common schedule every day for 34 days, that I had built my routine on the foundation of consistent availability, that the moment I stepped through that entry panel and understood what I had entered, my only coherent thought had been to leave as immediately as possible, and that was exactly what I had done, though not before causing the damage I had caused. I told them about reaching for the vessel in a panic, about the chain I had not seen, about the sound the crystals had made. I described it precisely because I thought they deserved the precise version and not a softened one. Then I said that I was sorry about the crystals specifically, and separately from everything else, because I understood they were not equivalent to the rest of what had happened. The rest was an accident of ignorance and timing. The crystals were something I had caused with my own hands, through my own panicked action, and I took that distinction seriously. I stopped then, because I had said everything honest I had to say, and adding more words beyond that point would only be noise. Vale Sarah looked at me for a moment with the precise and steady focus that was simply her natural mode of attention. Then she said that the crew review had confirmed my account matched the sensor records in every detail, and that she believed what I had told them. I let out a breath I had been holding since the night before. Then she said something I was not prepared for. She said that the offense was not the one I had imagined it to be. I asked her to explain. She told me that the concept I had been carrying around all night, the idea that seeing another being without their outer covering was a form of violation, something requiring apology and atonement, did not exist in Sorvathi culture in any equivalent form. Their exoskeleton was their body. It was always present. It was not something that could be removed or replaced. The concept of being seen without a covering had no Sorvathi parallel because there was no covering to be without. The specific shame I had been living with since the previous evening was entirely my own. It did not translate to them. They had received no offense from that part of what had happened. She said the offense was the crystals. That landed differently than I had expected. Not worse, just true, and very specific. She told me that the 14 crystals represented 14 ancestors of their family bloodline. Each had been placed on that rack by a living family member at the time of that ancestor's passing. Each crystal was believed, in Sorvathi tradition, to carry the name and the continuing presence of the one it represented. To disturb them was not like breaking an object. It was closer to interrupting a conversation that was already in progress between the living and those who had gone before. I stayed with that for a moment. Then I said I was sorry in a different way than I had been before, because the first apology had been about the intrusion, and this one was about the loss, and I wanted to be certain they understood, that I knew those were not the same apology, and I was not treating them as the same. Kaelira spoke for the first time. Her voice was quieter and more deliberate than her sister's, each word given a half moment of additional consideration before she released it. She said that they did understand the distinction. She said that the fact that I had drawn it was not a thing that every outsider would think to do. Then she asked me something that caught me entirely off guard. She said, "Your outer covering, it is not permanent." I said that was correct. It could be removed and replaced. She said, "You constructed a second layer and placed it on top of your original form, a chosen external surface." I said, "Something like that, yes." She tilted her head at her thinking angle. Then she asked, with careful and precise language, what was beneath that outer layer? Not in any way that carried complicated implications between humans. In the way a scholar asks about something she has encountered and wants to understand, with complete and uncomplicated curiosity, no different in kind from how she would ask about anything else she found interesting. I thought about how to answer simply and honestly. I told her that humans were soft on the outside, that our surface was not protective in any meaningful sense, that it marked everything that had happened to us: heat, cold, age, injury, and the simple weight of time passing, that we healed slowly and imperfectly, and we kept the evidence of every significant event written into our outer surface, whether we wished it to remain there or not. I told her about my scar, because it seemed like the most honest, specific example available. A fall when I was 7 years old from something I had been told not to climb. Surgery afterward, a mark on my left side that had been there for more than 20 years. I had spent most of my adult life being mildly embarrassed by it, in the particular way that you are embarrassed by something you cannot explain and cannot change. Kaelira was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then she said, "You carry a visible mark of survival on your body at all times, whether or not you intend to display it." I said yes, that was accurate. She said, "Among our people, warriors mark their chitin after great battles deliberately, as a permanent record of what they have endured and survived. It requires ceremony. It requires the intention to create something meaningful. You carry yours without ceremony, and without intention. You carry it simply because you were present when it happened, and your body recorded it, and it has remained there ever since." I did not have a response ready for that. I sat with it, and found that it was doing something slow and unexpected to the way I had always thought about the mark on my left side. Vale Sarah said that they had reached a decision. They would not file an official incident report. The matter would remain between the three of us and the captain, who had already been informed and had deferred the resolution entirely to her sisters. What they required from me was participation in a restoration ceremony for the spirit crystals. Not a replacement. A crystal could not be replaced. and the Sorvathi tradition did not believe in pretending that loss had not occurred, but a formal act of acknowledgement and honoring that recognized the interruption and asked the ancestors for patience with an outsider who had acted from ignorance rather than disrespect. I agreed without hesitation. She told me what the ceremony required. I would need to speak the names of my own dead, aloud, in the crystal room. Not formal ancestors in the bloodline sense, simply the people I had known and lost. One name, and after the name, one quality, one true and specific thing I remembered about that person. The Sorvathi believed that spoken memory was the closest the living could come to the presence of those who had gone, and that offering this closeness in the crystal room was the appropriate form of acknowledgement. I told her I could do that. She asked, with the precision she applied to everything, "Do you have dead to speak?" I said yes, more than I sometimes knew what to do with. We went to the crystal room that evening. The broken pieces had been gathered and laid on a clean cloth in the center of the floor. The offering vessel was back on its shelf. Someone had placed a single warm light source in the corner, creating an atmosphere the room had not had the previous evening, something between ceremony and privacy, formal and intimate at once. I stood in front of the gathered pieces, and I said my mother's name. She had died 4 years earlier, and I still occasionally forgot, for a single second in the morning, before I remembered all over again. The thing I said about her was the most specific true thing I knew. She laughed before she understood why something was funny, and then she would understand it, and then she would laugh a second time in a different way. I had never seen anyone else do exactly that. I said my grandfather's name. The true thing about him was that he was the only person I had ever known who was genuinely never in a hurry, and who never made you feel that your time with him was borrowed from something more important elsewhere. Then I said a third name, which was Oliver, and I stopped because the word dog was not going to survive direct translation, and I needed to explain. I told them that a dog was an animal, that dogs and humans had lived alongside each other for so long and in such close contact that the relationship had altered both species in small ways across thousands of years. That Oliver had been my companion for 11 years, that he had died 2 years before I boarded this ship, that I still, sometimes, reached my hand down toward the floor beside my chair when I was reading, before I remembered he was not there, and the floor was simply a floor. I said, "I know that is different from the others." Kaolira said, "It is not different, it is exactly the same. He was yours, and he is gone, and you carry him. That is precisely what this ceremony is for." I finished speaking. The pieces lay on the cloth in the warm light. Nobody moved for a long moment. And then there was a sound. Not a breaking sound. The precise opposite of a breaking sound. A tone, very faint, very clear, like a string being plucked somewhere deep inside a very large room. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds and stopped. I looked at Vale Sarah. Her crest was in a position I had never seen and could not read. I looked at Kaolira. She was looking at the crystal pieces with an expression that I could identify clearly even across the distance of species and biology, the expression of someone who has just found evidence for something she had theorized but never expected to actually observe. The silence after the tone lasted a long time. Then Vale Sarah said, quietly and carefully, that the crystals had not responded to an outsider in 4,000 years of recorded Sorvathi history. We stood there together in the warm light, all 3 of us, and none of us said anything more for a while. There was nothing more that needed to be said. The moment was complete, and we were all inside it, and none of us were entirely certain yet what it signified. I thought about the distance between what I had expected when I stepped through that entry panel days ago, and what had actually happened. I had prepared myself for formal consequences. I had expected the kind of professional failure that would follow a person in records and recommendations for years. What had arrived instead was a ceremony, a genuine reconciliation, and now a sound from crystals that were 60 years old, and had spent 4,000 years of documented history remaining silent in the presence of anyone outside the family bloodline. The lore keeper of the Vale Karen, a person whose entire professional purpose was the accurate documentation of exactly these kinds of events, was looking at those crystals with the expression of someone whose framework for understanding had just been asked to make room for something it had not previously needed to accommodate. I filed this in the part of my mind that held things requiring more time than I had in the moment to understand them, and let the silence in the room continue for as long as it wanted to. Kaelira made a small notation on her recording tablet, her secondary limbs working with the fluent efficiency of someone whose hands know a task well enough to complete it without requiring the full direction of attention. She did not share what she had written. She looked at the crystals for a moment longer, then at me, then at her sister. Vale Sarah said the room should be monitored, and that she would speak with the technical team in the morning about establishing a log for any further resonance events. Then she looked at me directly and told me that the restoration had been completed to the satisfaction of the tradition, that what was asked of me had been done, that the matter of the original incident was formally closed. I thanked them. I tried to make certain that the full weight of what I meant by the thanks was present in the way I said it, not just the word but the thing behind it, the actual gratitude, the actual recognition of what they had extended to me when they had no obligation to extend anything. Walking back to my quarters that night through corridors I was beginning to know with my body, rather than just my memory, I felt something I had not anticipated. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Something larger and quieter. Something that did not have an adequate single word, but that the closest available word was welcome. I had been in this place for weeks, and I was only now, in that specific evening, beginning to feel that I was inside it, rather than moving carefully through it. That was a thing worth noting. I noted it. 3 weeks after the crystal ceremony, I took a wrong turn on a route I had walked every day for 2 months, and ended up in a corridor I did not recognize for several seconds. And when I found my bearings, I was passing the open entry panel of the medical bay, and I could see inside. A young crew member was lying on a recovery platform alone. Her name was Serev. She was very young by Sorvathi standards, perhaps the equivalent of 19 or 20 in human years, and she had fallen during a navigation calibration drill earlier that day and broken 2 of the small interior bones in her lower left limb. The ship's medical team had responded immediately. Sorvathi medicine was exceptional at bone repair, which made sense given the structural complexity of a 6-limbed species with a protective exterior shell that had to heal in precise alignment with everything beneath it. The procedure had taken under an hour. Serev was stable, treated, resting. The medical team had moved on to other duties. She was alone, and her crest was flat against her back. Not the deliberate, controlled flatness I had learned to recognize as composed self-management. The collapsed flatness of someone who had stopped maintaining the performance of being fine because they were too tired and too overwhelmed to keep it up, and there was no one in the room for whom to maintain it. I knew the difference. I had been watching Sorvathi crest positions for weeks, cataloging them, noting the distinctions between the ones that were chosen and the ones that simply happened. This one had not been chosen. It had occurred. There was a specific quality to the involuntary positions, a kind of settled permanence that the deliberately adopted ones did not have, as if the body had found a level of honest expression and stopped there, rather than continuing to perform. This was that quality. She was genuinely overwhelmed, lying in an empty room, and no ceremony was required for me to understand it. I stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about what I was doing, and whether it was appropriate, and what the protocol implications were, and whether I had any business being in that room at all. Then I went in anyway. I am not certain that what happened between the moment of thinking and the moment of entering could be accurately called a decision. It felt more like the decision had already been made below the level where I was doing any deliberate thinking, and what I was doing consciously was simply following it. I did not say anything when I entered. I had learned in 34 days and then the weeks after that, the Sorvathi sometimes found the human impulse to fill silence with words exhausting rather than comforting, and I had learned in considerably longer than that words were not always what a situation required. I found the nearest available surface, a low equipment shelf along one wall, and I sat on it in a way that brought me to roughly Serev's height as she lay on the platform, close enough that she could see me without turning her head, and I stayed there. She looked at me. Her compound eyes were amber. The color I had noticed was common in younger Sorvathi, before the pigment deepened with age. The translation program in my earpiece rendered what she said as, "You do not need to be here." I said, "I know." She looked at the ceiling again. I stayed. I had no technique and no plan. I was doing the only thing that had ever made complete sense to me when someone was hurting and alone, making myself available without making my presence a demand. My mother had done this for me when I was sick as a child. My grandfather had done it on the day I failed my first major academic evaluation and came home certain that I had permanently ruined everything. Oliver had done it every single time, without exception, with a fidelity that did not diminish across 11 years, because dogs understood this particular form of care better than almost any other living thing. You simply stay. The offer and the action are the same thing. The thing is just to staying. I sat there in the quiet medical bay and did nothing useful, and that was the entire point. About 20 minutes after I sat down, Serev's crest moved. Only slightly. It lifted off her back by perhaps a third of its full height, which for a Sorvathi in a rest state after injury was the equivalent of someone drawing a full breath for the first time in a while and sitting slightly straighter. She asked me what I was doing there. I said, "Sitting with you." She asked, "Why?" I said, "Because you were here, and I was in the corridor, and that seemed like enough of a reason." She was quiet. Then she asked if humans typically stayed with each other when they were in pain. I said yes. We had been doing it for as long as anyone could accurately determine. It was one of the most fundamental things our kind did for each other. She said, "It is strange. You are not doing anything." I said, "Sometimes not doing anything is the whole of what needs doing." The translator flagged her response as a sound it could identify as communicative, but not yet classify. But her crest lifted another fraction, and after a while, she stopped looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has been let down by it, and started looking at it the way you look at something that is simply a ceiling. I did not know that Vale Sarah was standing in the corridor outside the medical bay until I heard her voice behind me, speaking to Serev in the formal register, asking after her condition. Serev answered briefly and correctly. Then Vale Sarah looked across the room at me, and I saw her crest perform the slight rightward tilt that I had logged in my field notes at least 6 times, with a question mark beside it, because I could not pin down what it meant. She did not speak to me in the medical bay. She waited until I had said goodbye to Serev, and stepped back into the corridor, and then she fell into step beside me, for the first time walking alongside me rather than in front of or behind me, and she asked what I had been doing in there. I explained the wrong turn. I explained what I had seen through the open panel. I explained what I had done in the room, which was nothing except sit on a shelf and remain present for 20 minutes, and the reason I had done it, which was that she was there, and hurting, and alone, and I had been in the corridor. Vale Sarah was quiet for longer than her usual pause before speaking. Then she said, "Why did you stay with her? She is not bonded to you. She has no connection to your bloodline. You had no formal obligation." I thought about it seriously, because she asked serious questions, and deserved the serious version of the answer, rather than a quick one. I told her that the obligation, for humans, did not generally require a previous agreement or a formal relationship, that the obligation came from the situation itself, from the presence of someone in pain and the presence of yourself nearby with the capacity to help, that if you encountered those two things simultaneously, you were already in some form of relationship with that person, whether you had arranged to be or not. That ignoring the relationship was also a choice, and not a neutral one. I said, "The hurt is the reason. It is always enough of a reason. You do not need a different one." Vale Sarah stopped walking. I stopped too, because she had, and turned to look at her. Her crest was rising, slowly, and fully, and completely, the position I had seen in a formal historical recording once, used by a senior officer during a ceremony of recognition, the acknowledgement of something that had proven itself, the position that the documentation described as reserved for moments of genuine equal standing, being extended from one party to another. She said, "Among our people, comfort is a formal act. It requires ceremony. It requires acknowledged relationship, established rank, the explicit or inherited permission that comes from bonded connection. What you did in that room required none of those things. None of them." I said, "Yes, that is roughly the entire point of it." She was quiet for a moment. I waited, because I had learned that her quiet was almost always working towards something, and interrupting it was rarely useful. Then she said something I had not expected her to say. She said that she had been thinking about the crystal ceremony since the night it happened. She said that she had been trying to understand, using the frameworks available to her, why the crystals had responded. The Sarvathi scientific tradition had multiple theories about the resonance mechanism, none of them fully satisfying. The dominant one held that the crystals responded to specific biological signatures associated with the family bloodline that had established them. But the family bloodline was Sarvathi, and I was not. So either the dominant theory was incomplete, or there was something else happening that the theory did not account for. She said, "I keep returning to what you said in the ceremony, the dog's name, the way you said it." I waited. She said, "You did not say it differently from the others. You did not apologize for it, or explain that it was lesser than the human names. You said it with the same weight and the same stillness, and the crystals sounded afterward. I said, 'He was mine, and he is gone, and I carry him.' That is what Kaolira said it was for." Vale Sarah said, "Yes, but I think it is more specific than that. I think it was genuine, in a way that cannot be performed. And I think the crystals respond to the genuine version. And I think, this is the part I have not yet shared with anyone, and I am not certain I have language for. I think that humans may be constitutionally incapable of performing grief the way other things perform it. That when you grieve, it is always the real version. That you do not have a ceremonial mode available for the feeling." I thought about that for a long moment. Then I said, "I think that is probably true." I had never thought about it as a specific thing we did or did not have. It was just the only way I had ever known grief to feel. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she said she needed to return to navigation, and she moved away down the corridor. I noticed that she was walking slower than her usual pace, the way people sometimes do when they are thinking so intently that the body falls behind. That evening, Kaolira appeared at the entrance of my quarters. She had begun doing this over the past few weeks, appearing after her shift ended, to show me something she was working on, or to ask a question about human language, or a behavior she had observed, and wanted to understand more accurately. The visits had started so gradually and so naturally that I had not noticed them becoming a regular occurrence until they already were one, and had been for some time. She showed me a document she was developing on her recording tablet, a lexicon, a systematic and growing collection of human emotional states, behavioral patterns, and social practices that had no direct equivalent anywhere in the Sarvathi language or cultural framework. She had been building it since shortly after the crystal ceremony, she told me, adding entries whenever she observed something she could not accurately classify using the conceptual tools she already had. The list had 43 entries. I looked at that number for a moment before I began reading. 43 things she had needed to create new vocabulary for. 43 concepts that the entire accumulated language and cultural tradition of the Sarvathi collective, developed across a history that made human civilization look brief, did not have a pre-existing word for. I had known intellectually since my briefings before boarding that human and Sarvathi culture were different in fundamental ways. Reading that number, 43, made the difference specific in a way that the abstract knowledge had not managed. I scrolled through it slowly, reading what she had written. Some entries I recognized immediately as things I had done or said in her presence, moments she had observed and then set aside to examine more carefully afterward. Some were broader patterns, assembled from multiple observations across different situations, synthesized into something she had defined and named. Entry 17 described the practice of remaining with another being, in pain without speaking, without performing any observable function, without any apparent purpose, except the fact of continued physical presence. It noted that there was no Sarvathi equivalent. It listed the function of the behavior as unclear, and noted that the measurable effect was a reduction in distress indicators. The entry did not try to explain why it worked. It simply recorded that it did. Entry 31 described laughter that occurred at the same moment as the recognition of one's own mistake, as if perceiving the error and finding it funny were parts of the same event rather than sequential ones. It noted that this appeared to reduce distress both in the person laughing and in those observing the laughter, and that the mechanism was not understood. Entry 38 noted that humans expressed grief for non-human beings in the same emotional register and with the same behavioral markers as grief for human ones. and that this suggested the threshold for human bonding did not require biological similarity or cognitive equivalence between the parties. Entry 41, which I had not expected to find, was about human humor during painful situations. It described the phenomenon of a person laughing about something that was simultaneously causing them distress, not as a way of denying the distress, but as a way of carrying it at a slightly different angle. Lira had written that this appeared to be a uniquely human adaptation, the ability to hold two contradictory emotional states at exactly the same time, without resolving them, and to function effectively while doing so. She had noted that she was not certain this was possible for Sorvathi, who tended to process emotional states sequentially rather than in parallel. She had marked the entry with a symbol I recognized as meaning, requires further observation. Entry 42 was about the particular human behavior of giving other people things that are personally meaningful rather than materially valuable. She described the specific social weight that a gift acquired when its value came entirely from the significance it held for the person giving it. When the only reason the object mattered was the fact that someone who cared about you had chosen it specifically. She noted that the Sorvathi gift tradition was based primarily on formal value and ceremonial appropriateness. The human version operated on a completely different logic that she found genuinely difficult to model, because it required knowing someone well enough to understand what they would recognize as meaningful, and extending that knowledge through an object, and trusting that it would land correctly. She wrote that this was a form of vulnerability dressed as generosity, and that humans appeared to perform it constantly without recognizing it as risky. I read that entry twice. Then I handed the tablet back and told her the lexicon was remarkable work. She said that she had a new entry to add that evening. She had been going to add it regardless, but what she had observed that day had clarified something about it that she had been uncertain how to describe. She tilted her head at her thinking angle and said the entry was about a quality she did not yet have a complete name for. She described it as the willingness to enter the experience of a stranger's pain without being summoned, without preparation, without any expectation of acknowledgement or return. She said it seemed to be a thing that happened before the decision to do it, and she wanted to understand whether the decision existed at all or whether the action preceded it. She said, "I have a question about this one." I waited. She said, "Is it chosen? Does the human decide to do it? Or does it simply occur?" I thought about that carefully. It was a genuine question, and she was asking it with complete seriousness, and she deserved the genuine answer, rather than the comfortable one. I told her I thought it was both, and that the fact of being both was important to what it actually was. The impulse, the initial movement toward a person in pain, happened before any deliberate decision, often before awareness. But the staying was chosen. The remaining in place when leaving was possible, required something intentional, and you needed both parts, or the complete thing was not there. She made a note on her tablet. I did not ask what she had written. What I did not know that evening, sitting in my quarters with the ship's night cycle darkening the viewport, was that the High Council inspection ship had altered its course 2 days earlier. I did not know who was leading the inspection, or what the inspection was looking for, or that the decision about whether I remained on the Vale Karen would very likely be made by one person in the next several days. Lira had been informed earlier that evening, before she came to my quarters. She did not tell me, and I had no reason to ask, and we talked about the precise difference between missing someone and mourning someone, until the last of the ship's light dimmed, and the stars outside were the only things left in the dark. The inspection ship arrived on schedule, and Admiral Valkara came aboard with 4 officers and a stillness around her that the entire crew felt before she had cleared the docking corridor. I watched from a respectful distance during the initial receiving protocol, standing far enough back that I was within bounds, but close enough to observe. She was tall even by Sorvathi standards. Her exoskeleton had deepened to a dark cobalt with age, almost black at certain angles of light, with a surface texture that spoke of decades of wear, without any suggestion of diminishment. Her crest was permanently elevated to a position that every officer and crew member on the ship visibly registered, their movements becoming more deliberate, their postures straightening, the general atmosphere of the receiving area shifting the way a room shifts when someone enters it who expects a different quality of attention than it had been giving. I had been told she was coming. Kaolira had told me the morning after the inspection was announced, sitting at the small table in my quarters with her recording tablet and the composed posture she adopted when she was about to give me information I needed to have, regardless of whether it was comfortable. She told me the facts without editorializing. Admiral Veilkara, 40 years of active diplomatic command, the longest-serving flag officer in the Sorvathi Collective at the present time. She had personally negotiated 3 interspecies agreements that remained in effect. She had also terminated 2 diplomatic initiatives she had determined were not serving the collective's genuine interests, and in both cases, subsequent events had confirmed her assessment. Kaolira had told me these things precisely, and without additional comment. She was not trying to frighten me. She was giving me the data I needed to prepare, which was the most useful form of care she knew how to offer. I was frightened anyway. There was no point pretending otherwise. The Admiral reviewed crew performance, system status, and mission documentation in the first 2 days. She met with Captain Veilmora for 3 hours on the first evening. She interviewed every department head on the second day. Her inspections were thorough in a way that left nothing unexamined, and no one in any doubt about how seriously she took what she was doing. On the third morning, she requested to see me. The meeting was in the Hall of Translation. She arrived before I did. When I stepped through the entry panel, she was already seated at the far end of the long table, her crest in the uncompromising position that the crew had been treating with visible deference since her arrival, her compound eyes tracking me from the moment I appeared in the doorway, with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone who was already gathering information before the conversation had formally begun. I sat down. I inserted my translation earpiece. I folded my hands in front of me and waited for her to speak first, because it was her meeting, and she had called it, and the appropriate thing was to let her set the pace of it. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and I let the silence sit there without trying to fill it. Then she asked me questions. She asked about my qualifications. I told her everything, including the paper about the mountain language and the 11 people who had read it. She asked 3 follow-up questions about the specific grammatical voice system described in the paper, questions that indicated she had either read a summary of it or had a deeper understanding of linguistic structure than I would have expected from someone in her role, and possibly both. The follow-up questions were precise, and she listened to my answers with the same quality of attention she had been giving everything since she boarded the ship. She asked about my mission objectives and whether I believed I was meeting them. I told her I believed I was making real progress, but that progress in cross-species cultural liaison work was difficult to measure accurately, that the metrics available to me were imperfect at best, and that I tried to account regularly for my own bias because my training had been thorough in many respects and incomplete in others, and I was aware that the gaps were the things most likely to cause serious problems at unexpected moments. She asked about the crystal incident. I told her everything in full detail, the same way I had told the sisters, without softening any element of it. I told her about the chain, the sound, the klaxon I had not known I had triggered on the way out. She asked about the medical bay. Someone had told her about Serev. I told her about that as well. The wrong turn, what I had seen through the open panel, the 20 minutes of doing nothing on a shelf because nothing was what the situation required. Then she began asking questions about Sorvathi history, ceremony, and diplomatic precedent, and she was clearly doing what she had been doing since she arrived, which was testing the actual shape of what I knew and did not know, the real edges of my preparation and the gaps within it. I answered correctly when I could. When I could not, I said so precisely, and then I explained my reasoning, the model I had been working from, the assumption that had led me to the wrong answer, what the correct answer suggested about where my model needed revision. I treated every wrong answer as data rather than damage, because it was, and there was no point performing confidence I did not have in front of someone who was specifically looking for where the performance ended. Twice during questions I got wrong, she paused for several seconds before moving to the next one. The first pause came when I was working through my misreading of the Sorvathi concept of territorial acknowledgement in deep space. I had been interpreting it through a framework drawn from human political and navigational history, which did not quite fit the Sorvathi framework in ways that were specific and identifiable. When I explained the reasoning that had led me to the wrong reading, she was silent for 4 full seconds. I did not try to interpret the silence. I waited. The second pause came after I offered a comparison between the resonance theory, underlying the spirit crystal tradition, and a phenomenon in human physics, the way vibrations in one object can induce corresponding vibrations in another object through a shared medium, without any direct contact between the two objects, simply through the transmission of energy across the connecting space. She looked at me for a longer time after that one before she spoke again, and what she said next was not about the comparison I had offered, but about something else entirely, as if the comparison had confirmed something she had already been thinking, and she was ready to move on from it. The meeting lasted 2 hours in total. When she stood at the end of it, I stood as well. She looked at me one final time with the crest position that her daughter's crew had been navigating around for 2 days, steady and unreadable, and then she left without any additional statement. I sat in the empty hall of translation for a while after she was gone, alone with the stone smell and the quiet, trying to determine what the meeting had been, what it had revealed, what it had been looking for, and whether it had found it. I genuinely could not tell. I had felt alert throughout, more alert than I normally was, and I had answered from what I actually knew and been precise about the edges of my knowledge without apologizing for them. Whether that combination was what she had wanted, or something adjacent to it, I had no way to know from the outside. That evening, Kaelira found me in the documentation room where I spent most of my working hours, and told me that something was happening in the crystal room. The crystals had been formally restored in the weeks following the ceremony. The breaks were still visible. They would always be visible, but the tradition counted them as whole in the sense that mattered, and the family had formally received them back, and they had been returned to the rack in the crystal room. Since the evening of the ceremony, since the tone, the 2-second sound that none of us had expected, and all 3 of us had heard, the ship's monitoring systems had logged the crystals emitting the same faint resonance 17 times. Not on a predictable schedule, not more frequently during ceremonial occasions, not in response to the presence of Sorvathi family members. 17 times in 6 weeks, always briefly, always the same tone, always without an identifiable environmental trigger. The Admiral's technical officer had reviewed all 17 logged instances that afternoon, and had no explanation to offer. The resonance pattern did not match any known Sorvathi biological or chemical signature. It did not correlate with atmospheric conditions, ambient temperature, or any other variable the ship's systems could measure. It appeared to respond to something the instruments could detect but not classify, which meant the instruments were measuring an effect without understanding the cause. The Admiral had requested that all parties involved be present in the crystal room together. All 5 of us stood there: Captain Vale Mora, Admiral Vale Kara, Vale Sarah, Kaelira, and me. The repaired crystals sat on their restored rack. The single warm light was in its corner. The room smelled the way it always smelled: stone and age, and the thing I had never been able to identify. I noticed, standing there, that I had stopped feeling like a visitor in that room. Somewhere in the 6 weeks between the accident and this moment, it had acquired a specific coordinate in my internal map of the ship, a location that meant something that other locations did not. I had not planned for this. It had happened on its own, the way things settle into place when you have been somewhere enough times for the somewhere to become familiar in your body before you notice it with your mind. The Admiral examined the crystals carefully and without haste. She spoke with the captain in the high formal register that my earpiece translated more slowly than ordinary speech, working through the more complex diplomatic grammar. She questioned the sisters at length about the ceremony, about the sequence of events since it, about the monitoring logs and what the technical team had and had not been able to determine. I waited and listened to as much as my earpiece could render. Then she turned to face me directly. She said, "You performed the restoration ceremony for these crystals." I said, "Yes." She said, "You spoke the names of your dead." I said, "Yes." She said, "Including a non-human animal." I said, "Yes, Oliver." I explained what a dog was. She looked at the crystals for a long time. Then she spoke with the measured and precise care of someone choosing each word individually before speaking it. She said, "You are telling me that this being, soft-bodied, temporary-skinned, capable of profound situational disorientation at an unexpected moment of vulnerability, grieved with sufficient authenticity, that he left an impression on ancestral crystals that have not responded to a non-Sorvathi presence, in 4,000 years of documented history. Kaelira said, "Yes, Admiral. That is what we are telling you." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I began to count my own heartbeats. Not intentionally, just because I had nothing else to do with my attention in the space. Then, I watched the Admiral's crest. It moved, slowly, and with full deliberateness, all the way up, the complete and sustained rise, held at its full height. I had seen this position in one historical recording, used by a flag officer during a ceremony of formal recognition between Sorvathi ships of equal standing. The documentation described it as the acknowledgement of an equal, extended upward, directed toward the person being recognized, rather than downward toward someone of lesser standing. She was not looking at me when she did it. She was looking at the crystals. Then she looked at me. She said, "In 40 years of command, I have worked alongside representatives of 11 species. I have signed 3 agreements that altered the structure of interspecies relations in this part of space. In all of that time, across all of those encounters, I have not once witnessed a being outside our own kind cause our ancestors to acknowledge a living presence." She paused, and in the pause the room was completely quiet. Then she said, "Humans are either the most dangerous presence in this galaxy, or the most necessary one. Possibly they are both at the same time." No one responded. I do not think she expected anyone to. She reached into the document pouch at her side and removed a recording chip and handed it to the captain. She said she was classifying the Crystal Room incidents under a specific formal designation. The Sorvathi term she used did not translate directly, but Kaelira rendered it for me later as resonance witness, an ancient honorific that had not been formally assigned to any individual in living memory, and had never been assigned to anyone who was not Sorvathi. It carried no rank or command authority. What it carried was the formal acknowledgement that the ancestors of a specific family bloodline had recognized an external presence, had found it, in whatever sense the tradition attributed to the crystals, worth acknowledging. The title now applied to me. She would enter it in the official mission documentation transmitted to the High Council. She said her inspection was complete and that her formal recommendation would be filed within the standard period. Then she left. The captain followed. The sisters and I remained in the crystal room alone with the warm light and the restored rack and the quiet. After a long moment, Kaelira showed me her recording tablet. She had added a new entry to the lexicon that afternoon, while waiting for the meeting. Entry 44 said, "Belonging. The condition of being in a place, or among beings, where one's presence is not merely permitted or tolerated, but actively wanted. Distinct from acceptance, which is passive. Belonging must be extended by the people doing the belonging, as much as by the person who belongs. It cannot be inferred from circumstantial evidence, or assumed from a pattern of neutral treatment. Humans appear to require it in order to function at their full capacity. It is not a comfort or a preference for them. It is a fundamental condition." She looked at me steadily, with her thinking angle head tilt softened into something I had not catalogued before, and was not going to put a label on. She said, "I wanted you to know that this entry is no longer theoretical." She left before I found the right response. I stayed in the room with the crystals for a while after she was gone, in the stone smell and the warm light, in the quiet that room had always had, and that I had come to recognize as its particular characteristic. I waited to see if the tone would come. It did not come that evening. I had learned to be patient about it, and patience was one of the things I had always had enough of. The day before my transfer back to the human diplomatic station, I could not sleep. The ship's night cycle had been running for over 2 hours, and I was still on my bunk, looking at the faint movements of starlight through the small viewport above me, thinking about what it felt like to leave a place that had mattered more than you had expected when you arrived. It is one thing to leave somewhere you always knew would matter. It is something else entirely to leave somewhere you had not planned on caring about. To feel the weight of that leaving, and recognize that the surprise of it, the way it crept up on you while you were paying attention to other things, had made it heavier rather than lighter. I was not good at leaving. I had known this about myself for a long time, not with shame exactly, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a pattern. I was good at arriving, at the initial days of establishing a new context, at the patient work of learning a new environment from the inside. Leaving required something different. Leaving required you to know what you were losing, and knowing was always the harder thing. My bags were already packed. I had done that in the afternoon, methodically and deliberately, because having a clear task helped the hours pass. My field notes, all 97 days of them, had been organized and transmitted to the archival team at the Human Diplomatic Station. People I had never met would read them in the coming months and use them as preparation for future contact efforts. They would learn from what I had documented. They would build on it. I hoped they would find it genuinely useful. I also hoped, lying there in the dark, that they would understand the notes were accurate but incomplete, that there were things I had come to know across 97 days that did not fit neatly into a field report, that lived in the gaps between the documented observations rather than in the observations themselves. In the early quiet before the ship's first activity period began, I made one last slow circuit of the Vale Cairn. I told myself it was to confirm I had left nothing behind in the spaces I had used regularly. This was a partial truth. The rest of it was something else. The engineering section was in its overnight mode, quiet and self-maintaining. The communications hub carried a skeleton crew running standard monitoring. The documentation room where I had worked most days of the mission was dark and empty, and I stood in the doorway long enough to look at it properly, and then I moved on, because standing there longer would turn into trying to memorize it, and you cannot memorize a place well enough to actually keep it. You can only have been there. I found myself at the entrance to the navigation deck without having made a specific decision to go there. The early shift was just beginning its handoff from the overnight crew. The space was in the productive, focused quiet of a transition, people moving efficiently, speaking in the shortened, precise exchanges that shift changes required, everything purposeful and unhurried at once. I had no particular reason to enter. I had no mission-related purpose there on my last morning. Vale Sarah was at her primary station. She saw me through the wide observation panels before I had fully decided what I was doing, and she made the gesture with her upper right limb that meant, "Come in," the specific angle I had first identified in my 5th week aboard, and had seen her use 3 times since, always with the same meaning. I went in and stood beside her at the curved navigation surface, where the 3-dimensional display mapped the space the ship was moving through in real time. The markers and annotations in the Sorvathi system occupied the lower 2/3 of the display, and the star field outside the viewport occupied everything beyond. I had spent months learning the notation system. I understood perhaps 2/3 of it with accuracy. The rest I was still working on. She did not speak immediately, and I did not try to hurry her toward speech. We stood looking at the display together while the handoff completed around us, and the early crew settled into their stations, and the ship's morning rhythm established itself. Then she said, "I was afraid of you when you came aboard." I looked at her. She said, "Not afraid in the way one fears something that might cause harm. A different kind of afraid. I was afraid that I would come to understand you better than you could ever understand me, and that this would be lonely, that I would be on one side of something transparent, and you would be on the other, and only I would know the barrier was there. I was afraid of asymmetry." I sat with that for a moment, holding it carefully, because she had just told me something she had been carrying for a long time, and she had chosen the last morning to say it. Then I said, "You were wrong about that." She said, "How?" I told her. I told her about every specific small thing I had learned to read in her, across 97 days. The precise crest position that appeared only when she was processing information that directly contradicted a model she had already built, and had not yet determined how to revise. It was different from the general thinking position, more contained, slightly asymmetrical. The angle of her secondary limbs that indicated she had solved something to her private satisfaction, but considered it professionally inappropriate to display that satisfaction outwardly. The half-second pause that preceded answers to questions she genuinely cared about the answer to, as distinct from questions she could answer automatically from training or routine, the pause was the sign that the question had reached somewhere real in her. The way her movement speed decreased when she was thinking at full capacity, as if the body understood intuitively that processing power was needed somewhere else, and reduced its own claims on it. The slight angular shift of her head, when she heard something that was approximately accurate, but not quite right, and was weighing whether to correct it or allow it to stand. There were 11 of them in my notes, catalogued across 97 days. I had never shared them with her because I had not known how to explain the watching without it sounding strange. Explaining it now felt like handing her something I had been carrying without knowing I was carrying it. By the time I finished the list, she was completely still in the way. She was still only when something had genuinely stopped her forward motion, not the controlled stillness of self-management, the organic stillness of someone who needed a moment before they could move again. She said, "You paid attention." I said, "That is what humans do when something matters to them. We pay attention, and we cannot stop. It is not a technique. It is not a strategy. It is just what happens when something is worth watching. We watch it. We cannot help watching it." She was silent for a long time after that. Long enough for the full navigation update cycle to complete on the display. Long enough for the ambient sounds of the ship's morning activity to establish themselves in the background. Long enough that I had stopped expecting her to speak and had started simply existing in the quiet beside her, the way you can exist in a quiet beside someone when you have spent enough time with them to be comfortable in it. Then she said there was something she had intended to tell me at the formal departure, at the docking port, but she thought she would tell me now instead. The resonance analysis report had returned from the High Council's scientific division. The preliminary assessment of the 17 crystal events since the ceremony was still being reviewed in detail, but the majority position among the analysts had already been established, and it was not expected to change substantially. Their conclusion, held with appropriate tentativeness, but by a clear consensus, was that the resonance mechanism required two simultaneous conditions. The first was biological presence in the room. The second was genuine emotional engagement. Not performed, not ceremonial, not the kind that was selected deliberately and shaped toward an intended effect, but the kind that was already occurring before any conscious direction was applied to it. The kind that was already present before you decided it should be. She said, "They believe the engagement cannot be chosen into existence. They believe it either exists in the moment, or it does not, and no amount of intention can create it if it is not already there." I said, "Is that what they believe happened during the ceremony?" She said, "Yes, that is what they believe happened." I looked out at the stars and thought about my mother, and the particular quality of her laughter, and about Oliver at the end of his long life still being glad when I came through the door, still turning his head toward the sound of my approach, and about a young crew member's crest, lifting a fraction in a medical bay, and how that fraction had mattered more than I had expected it to. I said, "I did not plan any part of it, not one thing." She said, "I know." I left the navigation deck and finished my circuit of the ship and returned to my quarters for my bags. The corridor that ran from the secondary residential section to the docking port was one I had walked dozens of times, and it looked different that morning, the way routes look different when you know you are walking them for the last time, and every familiar detail becomes something you are already in the process of losing. The crew was in the corridor, not the full crew, a significant portion of them, standing along both sides in a posture I had seen in one historical recording and had noted carefully in my files because I could not find a description of it in any of my official preparation materials. It was not a formal attention posture. It was not a greeting arrangement. It was something specific, a middle position, deliberate and precise, that clearly meant something specific to everyone present. Kaelira was standing near the docking port at the far end of the corridor. When I reached her, she told me what the posture meant. It was used, she said, when someone was leaving a place that they had made better, not a standard farewell. Not a formal departure honor of the kind that had established protocols and required rank acknowledgement. The posture used specifically when someone's presence had changed something, and when the people remaining wanted to mark that change before the person carrying it moved on. I walked the full length of that corridor. I looked at every face I passed, and I tried to hold them, to carry as many as I could with me, and I knew I was not going to manage all of them, and I tried to hold as many as I was able anyway. The faces looked back with crest positions I did not have full vocabulary for, and I was entirely out of time to learn them. At the docking port, Kaelira handed me a small flat recording chip in the Sorvathi archival format. The lexicon, transferred in full, all 44 entries. She said that there would be more eventually, and that she would transmit additions through official channels, which I understood to mean that the work was not finished, which I understood to mean something I did not have a word for yet. Captain Vale Mora was present at the port. She addressed me directly for the first time since my second day aboard the ship, setting aside 95 days of formal protocol with a deliberateness that I felt clearly. She said I had served the mission with a quality she had not previously had a name for, because the concept had not needed a name in Sorvathi diplomatic context before now. She said that was being corrected in the current documentation cycle. I thanked her. I turned to Kaelira and said what I could, which was not as much as what I wanted to say, and she received it with her thinking angle head tilt slightly softened into something I had decided I was not going to put a name on. I turned to Vale Sarah, who had appeared silently beside her sister at some point while I was speaking, and was standing with her crest fully raised, the acknowledgement position, sustained, directed toward me without qualification, the same position she had given to nothing and no one else in the entire 97 days I had been aboard this ship. I went through the docking port, the shuttle detached from the Vale Cairn, and pulled away into open space. I sat at the small viewport and watched the ship until I could no longer make out its specific shape against the dark, and then I watched the region of the dark, where it had been, until there was no longer any reason to watch. The shuttle took 4 hours to reach the human diplomatic station. I spent most of those 4 hours dictating my final mission report, because I had professional obligations and they did not pause for whatever I was experiencing. I organized the template. I covered each required section. I was systematic and accurate, and I met every structural standard the report required. Then I reached the personal assessment section, and I stopped talking. I closed the template document. I opened a new one, with no structure, and no headers, and no required fields. I said, what I learned about the Sorvathi. They are not a cold species. I want to be precise about this, because the word cold gets used casually, and it is wrong in this case, in a way that matters. They have built ceremony around emotion, the way an engineer builds careful containment around something very powerful. Not to suppress the power, or pretend it does not exist, but because left uncontained, it would be too much to function alongside. The containment is not dishonesty, it is precision. They contain their feeling with ritual and protocol, and the exact positions of crests that communicate what words are insufficient to carry. When that containment is respected, and learned, and read correctly from outside, when you take the time to learn the language it is written in, it is one of the most remarkable things a person can be permitted to be near. When they extend it outward, when they choose to bring an outsider into proximity with it, it feels like being trusted with something that does not give trust easily, or often, or without reason. What I learned about humans: we do not contain anything, we are porous. We shed feeling through every available surface, through the words we choose and the pause before we choose them, through what we reach for in the dark when we are half asleep and not thinking, through the names we say to broken crystals in a room that smells like stone and age, through the specific behaviors in a navigator's daily work that we catalog across 97 days because we cannot stop cataloging things that matter to us. We cannot make things stop mattering. We have never learned how. We have perhaps never really tried. We walk into rooms without knocking, in the literal sense, and in every extended sense of that phrase. Our immediate response when someone sees us, in our least prepared and most unguarded state, is to run, to grab whatever is closest, and hold it between ourselves and the exposure, and run. Sometimes, if we are very fortunate, they do not turn away. The sisters saw me at my most unprepared, my most exposed, my most comprehensively and unavoidably human. They saw me pull over 60 years of family memory in a moment of panic. They saw me stand in a crystal room and offer a dog's name with the same weight as everything else I offered. They saw me sit on a shelf in a medical bay, doing nothing observable for 20 minutes, because nothing observable was what the room needed. They heard me list 11 things I had been watching in a navigator for 3 months without her knowing I was watching. They did not turn away. That is the most important sentence in this report. It is more important than the protocol recommendations in Section 3. It is more important than the cultural framework analysis in Section 5. It is more important than everything else in the document combined, and I am aware that this is not the appropriate register for a professional mission report, and I am writing it anyway. The lexicon compiled by Kaelira is attached as Addendum A. It contains 44 entries, and represents the most complete human Sorvathi cultural bridge document currently in existence, as far as I am aware, which is to say, as far as anyone is aware. I am formally requesting full archival status for the document and requesting that Kale Lyra be listed as primary author. She built it, she structured it, she understood what she was building while she was building it. My name can appear second if the archival process requires a human co-author. She did the real work. Final recommendation to the program leadership and to whoever in the appropriate office makes decisions about what comes next. Expand the Human Liaison Program immediately. Not because the political timing is favorable, though I believe it may be. Not because the optics are good, though I believe they are. Because I spent 97 days as the only human aboard a Sarvathi vessel, and I was genuinely interesting to them, and not because I was exceptional, or uniquely qualified, or better prepared than someone else would have been. Because I was human, and humans are interesting to beings who have never encountered a species that cannot successfully stop being exactly what it is, even when it is trying very hard to be something more contained. That involuntary authenticity, the thing we leak through every scene whether we intend to or not, is not a flaw in our diplomatic toolkit. It is the most distinctive thing about us. I would like us to use it deliberately, with intention, with training that accounts for its actual function, and as soon as we can manage to begin. End of report. Marcus Hale, Cultural Liaison Specialist, Mission Cycle 7, requesting immediate reassignment to the Sarvathi Collective. Please. The shuttle docked at the Human Diplomatic Station at Standard Hour 14. I picked up my bags and pocketed the recording chip, with 44 lexicon entries, and walked through the pressurized connection corridor into the main facility, and stood for a moment in the corridor on the other side, while my eyes adjusted to the quality of light in a human-built space. Bright and even, and without variation, every surface equally illuminated, no warm corner, and no single source, and nothing in the light that told you which direction to look. An administrative officer was waiting for me. He was pleasant and organized, and he walked me toward the debriefing room at the standard pace of someone who had done this many times and found it straightforward. On the way, he handed me the station's current transfer manifest, arrival schedules for all incoming personnel across the next several weeks, organized by vessel assignment and arrival date and role classification. I took it because he held it out. I looked at it because it was in my hand. There were 2 names near the bottom of the list. Sarvathi designation, Cultural Observer classification, assigned to the next liaison vessel in the program's expanding second phase, listed plainly among the other names in the manifest as if they were unremarkable entries, as if I would simply read past them without the document becoming, for a moment, the most important thing I was holding. I stopped walking. The administrative officer continued for a step and a half before he noticed, and then he stopped and looked back at me with a patient expression. I did not explain. I folded the manifest once, carefully, and placed it in the same pocket as the recording chip. Then I took a breath. Then I walked on toward the debriefing room, because there were things waiting to be done, and they were not going to wait. And I had learned something in 97 days about staying present in the moment you were actually in, rather than the one you were hoping to reach. The station's light was very white and very even, and it smelled like recycled air and nothing else at all. I had solved harder problems than this, and this one, I was beginning to think, was going to solve itself.